Welcome to Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow. My name is Mariana Cordier, and I am your host. I'm coming to you from my home via Zoom. Throughout the decades, federal and local jurisdictions have instituted various legal reforms aimed at improving and addressing community concerns, flaws with the system, and protection of individual rights. The recent fatal encounters with police and the lack of equal treatment of the Black and Brown community has generated pressure for reform. To help us understand the current concerns and need for reform, I've invited two guests to discuss the important issues facing our country. My first guest, Thomas DeGonia, is a former prosecutor and in private practice and a partner at Etheridge Quinn. He is also currently the president of the Bar Association for Montgomery County, Maryland. My next guest is Delegate Gabriel Acevero. He represents the 39th District in Montgomery County at the Maryland State House and is the sponsor of the police reform legislation known as Anton Law. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on the show and to talk about such a really important issue about you want to call it justice reform, call it police reform. Tom, as an attorney, and I'm not asking you as the bar president or the position of your firm, but as someone who has been in the justice system quite a bit, what is your view about everything that's been happening during this pandemic, and not only recent times, but we all know that in the criminal justice system, we've faced issues with police and minority communities. What is your view on what's going on recently?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mariana, for inviting me to be on your show again. And thank you, Delegate Acevero, for joining us as well. I know the delegate has a lot of ideas about change and reform. And I'm happy to tell you about some of the things that we're doing with the Bar Association. We really are at an inflection point in our community, in our country's history. And we need to be at the forefront of change because I think it's change that's long overdue. And some have even said, this is a reckoning for a history. And I think it's critical that we proceed in an informed way. One of the first things that we've done with the Bar Association, we represent over 2,700 practicing lawyers in Montgomery County, is I set up a racial justice council. And there are really two prongs to that. One is community outreach and education of our own membership on systemic racism and the history of racism in our community. And the other is a criminal justice working group who has been meeting with police, who have been meeting with practitioners, and we're outreaching to the community for the impact in our community here in Montgomery County and how lawyers who have historically played in a very important role in that change, we're equipped both educating ourselves and helping get feedback so we can advocate for people in the courtroom, recognizing that we have systems in place and it's not just police. There are systems in place, whether it's in housing, whether it's in loans, whether it's in access to banking and financing, systems that have been infected with systemic racism, and how do we identify that and address that? So it's a much bigger issue than just policing. Now, policing has been the flashpoint for, I think, really bringing attention and focusing people on this attention. And you overlay that with a pandemic where people are in, and there's another added level of stress on everyone already, and it really makes for a powder keg. But
it's interesting that you say that, because we had done a previous show. We call it the tale of two pandemics, and it had to do with the pandemic, the health with COVID, and the other was with racial, the need for racial equality and the lack of equality. And so I think this pandemic has given us an opportunity to really highlight the fact that we're not as far along as we thought we were, or as people would advocate, oh yes, we already did the civil rights in the 60s and we're there. We're nowhere near there. Gabe, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show, because you are so in the center of, doing the legislation for police reform. Before I ask you to talk about that, I know there's a lot of confusion about what does it mean to defund the police, because this show's not about that, but I wanted to clarify for the audience what that actually is about. And you gave me such a great description that I thought it would be very helpful to share that with the audience.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marianne. And I think, the first step to the kind of systemic changes that we're talking about starts with these kind of conversations, particularly around terms such as defunding the police. When we say defund the police, in essence, what we are doing is setting up a budgetary conversation. What we're discussing is how our tax dollars, how county, how cities, how states, and the federal budget is spent, where it's spent, and how much is allocated to various causes and initiatives. And I think when we say defund the police, we're not just setting up a budgetary conversation, but it forces us to then take a look at the numbers. So let's take a look at the numbers. As a country, the United States spends around $115 billion annually on law enforcement, more than any other country spends on its military, save for China. As a state, Maryland spends a little over $2 billion on the state police and our correctional system. Mind you, this is in a state that incarcerates more Black people, more Black men between the ages of 18 and 35 than any other state in the union. And when we talk about the local level here in Montgomery County, we spend around, I'd say close to $300 million in our police department, not to include the sheriff's department, which is also another law enforcement agency with certain jurisdictions and certain police powers. And when we look at the budgets and what we spend on law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level, and then we look at the kind of an outcomes in our communities and the fact that communities, some people do not feel any more safe, some people are over-criminalized, over-prosecuted, and over-incarcerated, the lack of trust between law enforcement and the broader communities that they serve. When we say defund the police, we're not just forcing people to look at budgets, but we're also saying that these resources, these funds need to be reallocated into the communities and the data-proven solutions on how to reduce crime and how to keep our communities safe. And time and again, what that empirical data shows is that we achieve safe communities when we invest in things such as education, housing, when we invest in things such as job programs and mental health professionals, et cetera. And so we are asking for the reallocation of funds towards these areas that are proven and that would not only provide the kind of services that communities have been calling for, but would really bring us to a safe community. So when we say defund the police, we're really saying we're spending too much on law enforcement, and the outcomes of that is not a desired outcome. And we have to change our strategy, and we have to change where we're funneling money and move it away from a police state.
Right. And I know that the state attorney's office has community programs and outreach to the community to help along, to raise awareness and that kind of things. But Tom, do you know if the police have any programs currently?
Well, I want to say one of the things that the delegate pointed out is very accurate. It's what makes our community safer, and where are we spending that? What are our priorities? And I think you don't have to look very far for a study that's going to tell you that it is less expensive in the long term and makes our community safer to invest in a diversionary program for someone who has a drug abuse problem, or to divert them from the courts, or to divert them from incarceration. For someone who has a mental health problem, to divert them from the court system. The homeless person who may suffer from mental illness, who gets multiple calls at the local 7-Eleven, that requires police resources, it detracts from business, and that person, just to simply arrest him and put him in the system, isn't solving the problem. So we have to look at really solutions-based. And that's really what we're talking about. He's absolutely right when he says that we incarcerate more people than the state of Mississippi, more Black and brown people than the state of Mississippi. It is evidence, not just an indication, but evidence that there's a problem, and we need to re-envision and reimagine how we police. Now, the police department, at least in Montgomery County, they do have community-oriented policing practices, and they outreach to people. One of the things that I know there's legislation, I've been fortunate enough to speak with both delegates on the Judiciary Committee, as well as council members, as well as law enforcement. Police officers want to have a positive relationship, and that helps them have a better response in the community. And one of the things that I think is on the table for discussion and change is, how do we review police officers' performances? Not just by number of arrests, so we don't want them counting up. We want them to be evaluated, and this is something that the county council is working on. Is one of those evaluation points is your positive interaction. You attended a community event, you helped someone, you attended a religious service in your community. This wasn't a call for service, but those types of events. And I think they're really shifting their practice toward those types of events.
So Gabe, I know you've been working really, really hard on Anton Law, legislation that I believe will be introduced in January when the session starts. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So Anton's Law is legislation that I introduced with Senator Joe P. Carter from Baltimore City, who's been working on police reform way longer than I have, and well before I was elected to the General Assembly. But Anton's Law is legislation named after Anton Black, a 19-year-old college athlete who was killed in police custody on the Eastern Shore. And there were a number of things that were wrong with his death. One being that he should have been alive today, and one of the officers responsible should not have been hired by any other law enforcement agency in this country based on his use of force and complaints record. But he wasn't decertified, and he was a former police officer in Delaware, and he, like most officers who aren't decertified but are fired by law enforcement agencies, are hired by other jurisdictions. And so he moved to Maryland, and he was hired by the Greensboro Police Department, despite members of the community urging town officials not to hire him out of fear that someone of color would end up dead, because they knew about his record in Delaware. He was hired nonetheless, and not too long after that, Anton Black was not only arrested, tasered, essentially hogtied right in front of his parents and his home, but struggled and became unresponsive and can be heard saying that he couldn't breathe. And so many things was not only wrong with just the arrest, but the fact that someone such as this, a former officer, could be hired and protected by a system in instances of police brutality. And it really questions the system that we have right now and the inadequacies of our state law. And that's what Anton's Law is hoping to address.
So specifically, when we're talking about Anton's legislation, what is it, or Anton's Law, what is it specifically that it's proposing?
So Anton's Law addresses three things as it relates to state law. One is the Maryland Public Information Act, the MPIA, which in essence is sort of like FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, at the state level. And that sort of dictates what public agencies, what kind of an information should be shared, disseminated with the public upon request, et cetera. And in essence, Anton's Law would provide a complainant with a copy of the investigative file upon conclusion, but also any prior complaints against an officer or officers, which we know is critically important, particularly in rooting out certain corrupt and problem cops. But it would also address a law that is called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, or the LEOBR, which in essence is a state law that provides procedural protections to law enforcement officers, from transparency to investigation to outcomes of those investigations, and it also impedes accountability. And so Anton's Law would repeal a provision of the LEOBR that in essence says only a sworn law enforcement officer can investigate and interrogate another sworn law enforcement officer. So in essence, making investigations of police completely internal, right? And so there's no kind of a transparency, there's no kind of a civilian oversight. And
So the
lastly,
proposal is to make it where it's open to the public, or the public can see the report once it's completed.
well, by repealing that provision of the LEOBR, what we would be doing is strengthening civilian review boards, which is made up of citizens like the one in Baltimore City, so that they're able to provide that kind of an oversight, that accountability. And my hope is that they would have subpoena powers. But equally as important, Anton's law addresses also the lack of a statewide use of force standard. We do not have a statewide use of force standard. And as a result, what we see is officers time and again not only using excessive force, but force that is not justified given the circumstances. And so Anton's law would establish a statewide use of force standard with criminal implications for officers who, in essence, deviate or breach public trust or use excessive force when it isn't justified.
And what about the third, you mentioned there's a third option or a third item that the law is addressing, that is what?
So it's use of force. The first thing is the MPIA, the Maryland Public Information Act, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which I encourage your viewers and really everyone to understand, because the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights is a state law that provides special privileges, not rights, but special privileges to law enforcement officers that you and I do not have. And Maryland was the first state to pass an LEOBR in the early 1970s. And since then, a number of other states have followed suit, such as Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed, in Ferguson, such as Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed, such as in Wisconsin, where the father was shot 7 times in his back. And we oftentimes ask these questions, well, where is the oversight? Where is the accountability? Where is the justice? And a big part of that is these laws called the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights that needs to be repealed.
So with what you've heard and what you know, Tom, what do you think would be the legal community's response to Anton's law?
Well, I think there's certainly, I don't think there's any question that there needs to be more transparency in investigations and results so that when one of these incidents occurs, what could we have done to have prevented that incident? My understanding of the Bill of Rights, for the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, is that it's also very much a labor vehicle that protects employees. So there are intersections between what you do as a law enforcement officer, as well as, if you were a janitor's who was an employee. The major difference, obviously, is that we are asking law enforcement officers to make life and death decisions, often in a very split-second manner. So if there are going to be removal of some of those protections, I think as the law enforcement community would see it, then there needs to be the adequate training. We have to remember, we ask law enforcement officers to do a very wide range of things. I think that's one of the things to really kick off the beginning of the conversation where we talked about reallocation or reprioritization. A police officer has a call for service, and they really don't know what it is they're going to expect to get on the other side of that door when they call for service. We do need to train our police officers to give them more tools in their toolbox to de-escalate, to address someone who may be in a domestic violence situation, to address someone who may be suffering a mental health issue, so that we don't have these fatal encounters. And I think that's
one of that is one of the dilemmas, though. It's that we have to weigh, or they make us weigh. I imagine the police unions are going to be opposed and have generally opposed, any reform that could expose their members who are officers from losing their jobs or suspended or any of those kinds of things. And so, have any efforts, Gabe, been made to, get participation or to incorporate them in the conversation to the police unions, which I think will be probably one of the biggest hurdles to get this law passed?
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right, Marianne, in that the Fraternal Order of Police, the police associations, police benevolent associations have historically and continue to be opposed to any and all kinds of police reform. And I challenge anyone to show me differently. And the reality of it is that the solution to police violence rests in the communities most impacted. One of the things that I learned, as an organizer is that, those closest to the pain are closest to the solution, but seldom are they closest to power. And so the solution to police violence has been provided by Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities, the LGBTQ plus community that has a very a toxic relationship with law enforcement if you look at the history of the LGBTQ movement. And what it means is that we need policymakers, but we also need people who are in positions within our criminal legal system, because I don't believe we have a justice system in this country. But we do need people within our criminal legal system to understand the roles that they play, meaning the judge, meaning the public defender, but also the state's district attorney or local prosecutor, because they play a role in holding police accountable. But ultimately, the solutions to police violence rests in those communities most impacted, and we cannot train a diversity and inclusion train or coffee with a cop our way out of systemic oppression. And what we have to do is look at a system that is obviously providing unequal outcomes for groups of people, and we have to remove the impediments to that. And the impediments to that includes reforming the Maryland Public Information Act. It includes repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And I want to add something that was mentioned earlier by Tom. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights in no way has nothing to do with collective bargaining rights, which we provide to workers so that they have the right to organize, to form a union, to collectively bargain, etc. What the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, as I mentioned earlier, which 16 other states have to include Maryland, and 33 other states do not, 34 other states do not have it on the books, right, and seem to be operating under a different system. What the LEOBR in essence is providing these procedural protections that you and I as ordinary citizens do not have. And if we were to repeal the LEOBR, law enforcement officers will have the same due process protections. I'll say that again, the same due process protections as any other state and local public employee. So this idea that somehow they're losing rights, they're not. These aren't rights. Again, these are special procedural protections that we provide for law enforcement officers that does not exist in any other type of profession.
And I wanted to note, tragically, there was in Los Angeles two sheriffs in their patrol car that were shot by an individual. And there was a shooting in New York where two officers who weren't investigating or doing anything, they were just, I think getting coffee. I won't say anything about donuts, but they were also injured. And so I think there has to be somewhat of a clarification that, Anton's Law is not meant to demonize or make the police look like they're all bad, because we do need police. We do need their work and participation in the community. Would you agree, Gabe?
So oftentimes, and this is a pretty problematic conversation for a lot of people, myself included, because every time we have a conversation about police violence and police accountability, which, mind you, is not a new conversation. We've been having this conversation for...
No, we've been having this conversation for a very, very long time, decades worth.
Right.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when we have these conversations, it is painted as anti-police when there is absolutely no suggestion to that effect. What we are discussing here is the presence of corrupt and racist cops within law enforcement, and how do we build trust so that law enforcement can better do their jobs? Because if there is no trust, you cannot do your job, and I dare anyone to tell me different, right? You cannot
Right. And
do your job if
Tom, I'm sorry, Gabe. Tom, you were a prosecutor, so you know what it is to have to gain the trust of a witness or folks when you're prosecuting, and how that police interaction might interfere or work. With 2 minutes to spare, not very much time, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, certainly you've got to have trust, and it's the foundation of our criminal justice system, certainly our justice system. And I don't think you can have trust without accountability and some transparency. But I think at the end of the day, we also have to engage in a conversation with law enforcement about those changes. We're not going to change it overnight. It took us 400 years to get where we are. Not that we're not in a moment of change, and I think we need to capitalize on that and continue to push for reform and change. But I don't think we expect that we're going to get here overnight. And I think we need to bring in all of those stakeholders in order to make that real and substantive change, lasting change that's going to prevent these things from happening in the past. And it's certainly a discussion. I know the delegate's working hard on it. I know many others are working hard on it. I don't think there is just one answer. It's going to come from a lot of different places with a lot of different voices, and a lot of very important voices from our Black and Brown and Latinx communities, as the delegate will tell you. So.
Well, I have to say that I hope if anyone, members of the Fraternal Order of Police is listening, please, join the conversation. Don't necessarily block legislation because it seems like an attack or something different. We're only looking to make everybody better, not worse, and improve our communities across the country. So unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I would like to thank my guests, Tom Degona, Gabriel Acevedo, for joining me. Thank you so much, gentlemen, and our audience for watching us and participating. Thank you so much. Please join me next week at the same time, or you can also watch, if you miss us, the other segments of Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow show on YouTube. If you do, please subscribe, tag, like, share, and we are also on Facebook. I am Mariana Cordier. Until next time.